So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the 5th workshop in a series hosted by the West Valley Action Network, How Activism Made Us Safer and Why We Need More at the West Valley Nuclear Site. I'm Kriki Kazak and I work on Buffalo Commons. That's a joint collaboration between Partnership for the Public Good, a community-based think tank headquartered in Buffalo, New York, and the Cornell ILR Buffalo Collab of Cornell University. PPG has partnered with the West Valley Action Network and the Western New York Environmental Alliance to host this series of workshops. The West Valley Action Network formed as a loose association of individuals and groups in 2009 to work for the full cleanup of the West Valley nuclear waste site in West Valley, New York, Cattaraugus County, draining north into Erie County and the Great Lakes. It's comprised of many individuals and organizations in New York, the US, and Canada, working for the full cleanup of this site. To learn more about the current concerns of this network, you'll hear more today, and I'll be pasting some information to their website in the chat. As I mentioned, this is the 5th, so that there's several other workshops that you're welcome and encouraged to view if you haven't already, and I will put those in the chat as well. Last month, we had Indigenous People for a Nuclear-Free Future, ranging from the history of the West Valley Network to protections that are needed. There is one more workshop on October 26th at the same time, Climate Cleanup and Accountability at the West Valley Nuclear Waste Site. And I'll share more about that at the end of our conversation today. Before we get started, it would be really great if you could introduce yourself in the chat. This gets us a little bit more familiar with our Zoom here. So if you wanted to say your name, where you're joining us from, and anything you're wondering about today's session. If you need closed captioning, there's a button at the bottom labeled CC that should be able to provide that for you. Finally, to help with viewing, if you toggle in the upper right-hand corner where it says view, our recommended way is to click on speaker, and that'll provide you with the speaker and any slides that'll be shared. All right. So this workshop will feature Dr. Pat Townsend, and she'll share a little bit more about herself in a bit. But Dr. Townsend is an environmental and medical anthropologist who authored or co-authored multiple editions of college textbooks in both fields. Her early fieldwork as a cultural anthropologist was in the tropical forests of Papua New Guinea with her husband, Bill Townsend, a civil engineer. Subsequent research project took her to Superfund sites in Montana, Tennessee, and here at Love Canal. Since retirement, she has devoted much of her volunteer time to the West Valley nuclear concerns through her connections with several organizations, including the West Valley Citizen Task Force, Buffalo-Niagara League of Women Voters, and Anthropology Department at UB, including many others. From her perspective as a social scientist, Dr. Townsend will view highlights of public participation during the 6 decades of the West Valley nuclear site that had varying degrees of success in making us all safer from dangerous radiation. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Pat to get us started.
Thank you very much. And I will pass it on to my PowerPoint. I'm really glad for this opportunity. It's led to my learning even more. And whenever you prepare something like this, you get into a whole new sphere of understanding. So with no further hesitation, let's move along. Whoops, that didn't move along. There we go. You've probably seen this slide, this very slide, or slides like it in all the other presentations and maybe in other places as well. This is the 5th presentation in the series on the site. As you have learned from other presentations, we're on the verge of important developments in the cleanup of this radioactively contaminated place in the town of Ashford, about 35 miles south of Buffalo. You've been near the site if you've visited the sculpture park, or if you maybe picked blueberries near there, or visited the Zoar Valley, or anywhere along the Cattaraugus Creek. It's a beautiful area, and it continues to be beautiful at whatever age of cleanup, because radioactivity is invisible. Just downstream of the area is the spectacular Zoar Valley, through which Cattaraugus Creek flows on its way to Lake Erie in Irving. So, despite the contamination of this site, there are very good things going on there. Cleanup is going on, and the installation of solar panels on unused portions of the site that will feed the grid with clean power that does not produce nuclear waste. And the entire site that you saw is owned by New York State. So we all have a stake in its decommissioning. The first big event of the next few years is scheduled to begin in January and February. If nothing further occurs to delay it, it will take about 3 years to demolish the main process plant building. This was an extremely radioactively hot building. After 6 years, from 1966 to 1972, during which it chemically broke down used nuclear fuel rods into their constituents, uranium, plutonium, and other radioactive isotopes. This particular building is the last of several buildings to be demolished because it required so much preparation. For more than a decade, the workers there have been decontaminating as much as possible, both asbestos and radioactivity on the surfaces of the inner cells. Those inner cells are being cleaned by a process called nitroscission, which uses liquid nitrogen to clean contaminated surfaces. They've also been carting out movable equipment and cutting out pipes and just in general preparing the building. And that preparation continues to go on, although it's been delayed a bit because of COVID and the inability of workers to work in close quarters. As I said, the work there at the site began in 1966. Where was I in 1966? Well, Cricky gave you a clue. I was in Papua New Guinea collecting data for my dissertation. And it seems pretty far away. It is physically far away, but it's more than physically far away. It's a very different culture. And yet, it was really trying to get at many of the, just because of the way I was trained in anthropology, I was really trying to get at many of the same questions that are raised at West Valley. And that is, how does a society's choice of certain technologies and sources of energy impact human health and the environment? So while my neighbors in New Guinea were still cutting down trees with stone adzes, you can see the stone blade in that tool right there. They were basically working on the same kind of task of demolition that these hydraulic hammers were a couple of years ago at West Valley. So why did I, as an anthropologist, get involved at West Valley when I was retired and first learned about it? I've detailed some of the reasons that I am still involved there as an activist. I care about the water of the Great Lakes. I'm concerned about climate justice and environmental justice for the Seneca. I'm a cancer survivor, and I have friends who were not so fortunate as to survive. And I'm Elizabeth's grandmother. Elizabeth is 15, and future generations are not just an abstraction for me. I also belong to a faith community that teaches the stewardship of creation. And through my membership in the Western New York Interfaith Climate Justice Community, I've learned that many other religious traditions, probably all of them, teach a similar stewardship of creation. We've frequently met at St. Joseph's University Roman Catholic Church, which is shown here with active participation from Muslims. So I've shown a mosque, and the Seneca, who every year hold a dawn service at the site, which you can see in the background. You can see the large canisters in which they're the most highly radioactive waste that was solidified is still stored on site. And my own home church, North Presbyterian in Williamsville, has contacts, a sister relationship with a synagogue that's reflected in the friendship between our leaders. So that's how I happened to get involved. I went to a Sierra Club meeting and heard a presentation on West Valley with my husband. And they tried to recruit him as an engineer, but I realized that after 20 years of activism as a climate justice advocate, I was facing at West Valley probably the most serious climate change threat that we face right here in our own backyard, where we're not faced with encroaching raised sea levels. We're not normally yet experiencing wildfires, but a severe storm could wash those wastes into the watershed and into Lake Erie and to our drinking water. So it seemed like the right thing to do next. In this presentation, I plan to organize it around a simple three-part outline. That is, I've taken a snapshot at 3 points in time when public engagement was at a height, different kinds of public engagement, but they surrounded acts of Congress in 2 cases, or the releases of reports by government agencies in other cases. And people organized around that. So while these aren't necessarily the only or even the most important times when there was public engagement at the West Valley site, they'll give you a sample of what public engagement can be. So it's the arrow of time, and it extends off to the right because I'm not sure that the most important times for public engagement have yet happened at West Valley. There's probably 100 years ahead of us there. And I'm sure there'll be many important times when public watchdogging and public decision-making will be really important. But the 3 that I'm going to focus on are in 1969, when Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, 1982, when the first of several environmental impact statements were released concerning West Valley. And as you'll see later, it was hardly the final word. And in 2010, when the so-called final West Valley environmental impact statement was released. I intend to show that activism has made us all safer in the long run. So starting with NEPA, the activism surrounding NEPA didn't particularly take place in Western New York. It was at national level, and it was a bipartisan act of Congress that was passed in 1969 and signed into law by President Nixon on the 1st of January in 1970. It requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement, an EIS, in conjunction with any proposed action that would significantly affect the environment if it's done by a federal agency. And NEPA requires public input, both into the scoping of the EIS and in commenting on the draft before it's finalized. However cynical we might get, or however shy we might get about that participation, we must keep in mind that this is required of us. When I am engaged at West Valley, I'm not just being a pest, I'm being a responsible citizen. NEPA, after it was passed, was followed by similar acts in many states, including New York State's SECRA in 1975. Many states passed similar legislation that went even farther than the national legislation. And then there were all kinds of acts like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act at the national level, and again at state level, that followed on from it. What was the context that produced all of this burst of bilateral legislation everywhere? If you're as old as I, you can easily think back to the 60s, which opened with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and the discussion surrounding that. A biologist by the name of Barry Commoner popularized the concept of ecology and advocated for the passage of the nuclear test ban treaty by collecting baby teeth that showed that we were all exposed to fallout as a result of above ground testing, and that the fallout from that is still part of what is called background radiation. A couple of newsworthy events that occurred in 1969 couldn't have hurt the people who were trying to pass NEPA. The river in Cleveland that was on fire. That was not the first time it had been on fire over the decades, but it was pretty spectacular, as was the Santa Barbara, California oil spill. All of these things led to a great awareness on the part of the public of environmental issues, and the first Earth Day in 1970. But it also, because of requiring EISs, led to a burst of research on the environment. And certainly in my own field of anthropology, the 60s were a time of focus on ecological and in what later came to be called environmental anthropology. Legislation, NEPA was the first big piece of environmental legislation, but legislation doesn't really accomplish anything unless it's enforced or applied. That's the executive function. And sometimes to get that to happen, you have to push a bit. And these were the two pushers. Margaret Mead and Barry Commoner organized a group of 35 eminent scientists. They had gotten acquainted through their work with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In fact, Margaret Mead was the president of it in 1975 in the midst of all this. And they worked through a lawsuit. They sued the, seems like a very brave thing to do, even if you have a few Nobel scientists on your committee. They sued the Atomic Energy Commission in the Washington, D.C. District Court. Why did they do such a thing? The AEC, which is the predecessor of both the NRC and the Department of Energy, the AEC had prepared an environmental impact statement for a breeder reactor. It was just a pilot project. They just wanted to build one reactor. And there was nothing wrong with the environmental impact statement as a single statement, but the suit alleged that because that pilot project was intended to establish a whole program in which our whole energy system, we were worried about the oil running out at the time, you'll remember, in the 60s. They wanted to establish, the federal government was determined to establish a whole dependence on, a whole program dependent on breeder reactors. Now, breeder reactors use plutonium as fuel, and they produce more plutonium. Plutonium is the radioactive substance that is the trigger for atomic bombs. The concern of Mead and Commoner and the scientists that joined them was that this broad scale availability of plutonium to plain citizens outside the military would lead to nuclear proliferation around the world. And that was why they sued, and they sued successfully. And the AEC would have been required to write an environmental impact statement for the whole program of breeder reactors. The outcome, however, was that the next president to come along, President Jimmy Carter, changed policy and said that the United States would do neither the breeder reactor program nor the further reprocessing of used nuclear fuel to produce plutonium and uranium. Now, that last action did not, I'm getting ahead of my story because that last action did not take place until later in the decade. But these two and their committee set that in motion, that greater enforcement of NEPA, which is relevant to our situation here. So now we're to my second point in the 3-point outline, which is the passage of yet another act of Congress. This benchmark is the West Valley Demonstration Act. Became public law in 1980. And I've printed here on the right-hand side the first page of that act. Leading up to it, there had been a period of public scoping, which was written about by the League of Women Voters National, which their education fund in Washington, D.C., under contract to Argonne Labs, which was preparing the EIS. They analyzed the public scoping, which is it's in the Buffalo Library, this little book, and it's very revealing of attitudes toward the project at West Valley in that era. The passage of that act in 1980 and all that flowed from it in order to understand public involvement, we're going to need to back up a bit. There was a lot of activism surrounding the passage of that act and the EIS that it led to. And many of the people who became active at West Valley are still active. I look at the lists of people who commented in those scoping comments and people who commented about the EIS that resulted from the act back in 1980. There are many of the same people who are active today and still writing comments, still writing letters, still speaking up at meetings and organizing. And the organizations that took positions favoring the cleanup of the West Valley site are still engaged. They've been involved, they've been joined by many more, but the Coalition on West Valley Nuclear Waste, the League of Women Voters, the Sierra Club, and Roswell Park is interesting because they've always had people involved, although not organizationally so, but they've always had their staff involved. So let's back up to the formation of the coalition who worked for cleanup of this site, which became so polluted with radioactive isotopes in only 6 years of operation, reprocessing nuclear fuel. It's a process that if you've been here for the previous sessions, you have heard about from people far more qualified than I, people with degrees that are more relevant than anthropology. Although I must admit that one of the chief leaders of this coalition, now deceased, Carol Mongerson, who's in this picture as the woman who's third from the right with the pink shirt. She had a degree in philosophy and was working as an artist when she became the key leader of public involvement at West Valley and the formation of the coalition. In 1973, Nuclear Fuel Services that had operated the reprocessing at West Valley applied for a relicensing of their building after shutting down in 1972 because they needed to rebuild and meet new restrictions on their work. They were ready to ask for relicensing. And in order to do that, they would need a construction permit to bring their operation into compliance with the new environmental and safety standards. And they would have to have a 40-year license to keep reprocessing. So that application for license spurred several local individuals and groups to try to get intervener status to resist the development of that license, because they had locally been aware of the poor performance of nuclear fuel services for those 6 years and the terrible pollution that had resulted from it. A few women in the town of Springville on the southern border of Erie County and their neighbors in the village of West Valley, which is just south of Springville, got together and formed the Springville Radiation Study Group in order to understand these matters better and to seek intervener status in that licensing application. This is a 1969 picture in which they were celebrating the 25th anniversary of that event. They were formed in 1974. And as they began to work toward intervener status in the licensing application, they began to work with people from the Sierra Club as well and formed a broader coalition, which they named the Coalition on West Valley Nuclear Wastes. For those first few years in the 70s, they mostly held public meetings in Springville with invited speakers. And as they learned more, they clarified their own position in opposition to relicensing. And they were joined by all kinds, they were a bunch of housewives, but they were joined by a lot of others, including former reprocessing plant workers like Dave Piles and dairy farmers who didn't like what was going on in their neighborhood. And they were joined by a physicist by the name of Marvin Resnikoff, who continues, although no longer in Western New York, to follow the West Valley events. He was at that time in the Niagara group of the Sierra Club, while also teaching at UB, and he was able to continue their nuclear education, teaching them things like the hazardous life, 10 times the half-life is the hazardous life of some of these many isotopes that are present in the buildings and trenches at West Valley. There's strontium-90. If you've heard in earlier presentations about the wall of kitty litter that was built to contain a spill into the groundwater, that's the strontium spill. That has a hazardous life of only, shall we say, 280 years, but that's a lot longer than the life of a kitty litter wall. One of the biggies at West Valley is plutonium-239, which has a hazardous life of 240,000 years. And were it to be left underground, certainly the plateau would have completely eroded into the Great Lakes by then, much sooner than that. I've included iodine here because in addition to iodine that you might paint on a sore, there are other isotopes. Iodine-131 has a hazardous life of only 80 days, whereas iodine-129 has a hazardous life of 160 million years or more. Can you imagine? That was the one that was tracked by a graduate student at the University of Rochester, who showed that we have in our air in Western New York a measurable but tiny but measurable more amount of radioactivity than other places in the United States, because of it has the signal of the iodine that was released during operation of this plant. Not a dangerous level, but a measurable level, and it continues to be taken up and released from plants and animals. She was measuring trees, I think, mostly. West Valley has experienced probably more environmental impact statements than any of the Superfund sites that I ever studied in my early research life with these things back in 2000. We are not a Superfund site, but we sure have had a lot of environmental impact statements. The first one really just covered the process of vitrification, or they might have used another method had they chosen, the process of solidifying the liquid high-level wastes that were in tanks on the site. Those liquid wastes needed to be turned to a solid, and in this case by adding silicon and make at a high temperature and making them into glass rods. And they're still stored. It was a very successful project called the demonstration project, because it was demonstrating that that could be done, and it was done well, and it was celebrated. And as a result, many people thought West Valley was finished. It was not finished. There's still a lot of nuclear waste there. But the very first environmental impact statement had to do with that solidification process. And once the West Valley Demonstration Project Act was passed under the leadership of Stan Lundeen in Congress, and with witnesses from the environmental community here in Western New York, primarily Marvin Resnikoff, witnessing before the congressional committees 3 years in a row before that act was passed, the studies and public engagement were well underway, and that first of the environmental impact statements came out very quickly. After its draft was released, and then they moved to the final version in 1982, they had a single hearing held at West Valley High School, and they also accepted written comments on the draft, and those can be read in the 1-volume final environmental impact statement. It was one of the first documents that I laid my hands on 4 years ago when I started my serious attempt to understand what was going on at West Valley. Still have it out of the library after many renewals. It was in the law library at UB. Now you can assume someone's going to try to recall it. Oh, well, I have to say I'm through with it after 4 years. There was a map that just made me so angry and continues to make me angry whenever I look at it. This was figure 3.2 in this 1982 document, and it drew a 10-mile radius around the nuclear site, the West Valley site. What did that 10-mile radius map in? Well, you'll see that here. East Otto, place where they have the sculptures and the blueberry farm, and Delavan and Sardinia, and the railroad that runs north-south, mostly defunct throughout most of Western New York, but kept in good condition to use it, the spur of it to move wastes even now. So 10-mile radius, what does it includes Springville, of course, but it stops down Cattaraugus Creek before you get, you get through the spectacular gorge. But there's a little community there called Gowanda that I happen to be very attached to, where I have friends. And then there's the whole of the Seneca Reservation stretches from there to Irving on Lake Erie. And they were simply mapped out of it as though they did not exist. And I have gone twice through the very long list of people to whom this document was circulated. It's printed right in the document. And I see not a single person whose home address was Gowanda or Irving, not a single name that looks, at all Seneca familiar, and not a Seneca agency or government of any kind or official of any kind. But it's the map that makes me mad, and it's become my icon of environmental injustice. Subsequently, of course, the Seneca became very involved, but they sure had no informed consent at early stages. But that's somebody else's job to write a history of that. By the way, no one has written a book about West Valley, and that's not my job, but I hope that one of the things that this presentation might shake loose is someone who gets interested enough to spend some time in the coalition archives at Fredonia and at the University of Pretonia, and write a book about West Valley. Love Canal came into our knowledge about the same time as West Valley, and prompted action about the same time from President Jimmy Carter. In the one case, stopping reprocessing, which was going to take place in 2 new places in addition to West Valley. And in the case of Love Canal, the Superfund program. So while these two activities, two toxic sites, one south of us here in Buffalo, one north of us, they came into prominence, they came into news about the same time, they came into federal action at about the same time. There are at least a dozen books about Love Canal, some of them by journalists, some by social scientists, sociologists, and historians, some by participants, at least a dozen books on Love Canal, 0 on West Valley. I mean, of course, there are lots of government reports, as well as a very good full cost accounting study that was done under the leadership of the coalition, but no books, no popular books, nothing you can sit down to and learn the history all in one place. Okay, that's my spiel about the academic needs at West Valley. Let's go on with the activism needs. Okay, perfectly acceptable, incomplete, we might say, but perfectly ordinary environmental impact statement for the vitrification process. That just dealt with the liquid wastes in the tanks, though. It didn't deal with the waste that would be produced and left behind by that vitrification process. All the equipment and the leftovers, all the things that had been buried in the process of reprocessing that weren't simply the high level waste that made it to the tanks in liquid form as the output of a chemical process, all the other junk, many curies of radioactive junk in the radioactive dumps, 2 of them, the national area and the state area. With regard to the rest of the site, the Department of Energy, which had by now been established to take the place of the old Atomic Energy Commission, the DOE released an environmental assessment. Now, an environmental assessment indicates at the end that there is no significant environmental damage, so they don't need to do a full environmental impact statement. And that environmental assessment declared that there would be no significant environmental damage if they simply buried the waste on site, either in, if it was lower level, class A waste, in the same leaking unlined trenches that had been used before, or if it was slightly higher concentrations, but still dangerous. It could be cemented into barrels, and those barrels could be buried under what they called a tumulus. Tumulus is a word that's usually used for ancient grave mounds, but this would be a modern grave mound. The coalition was furious. I've stuck in a page of their June 1986 newsletter, the Coalition Crier, which was devoted entirely to that proposal to bury more waste into a site that was already leaking, and with a sketch of what the intention was. They argued that a full EIS was needed. What was the outcome? Well, it went to court, but it was settled without with everybody giving up a little, as they always do. But they got the basic thing they wanted was commitment to do an environmental impact statement, a full environmental impact statement that would look at the geology of the area, the hydrology, and as well as the social impact and so forth of burying wastes there. And that takes a while, of course, but they accomplished more than simply the commitment to do an environmental impact statement. They also got a commitment for access to information as that was being done, for regular public meetings. And we often hear the words when we have meetings and the coalition is asking for something, we often hear the word stipulations. Those were the various statements that came out of the court settlement surrounding the preparation of this proper environmental impact statement for the whole site and for its closure and management in the long term. In my concern about moving on, I really didn't discuss how the coalition was taking shape in these years. Some marvelous glimpses into that included back in 1982 when you look at the first environmental impact statement that came out, you pick up the passion that was expressed, as well as the detailed technical knowledge from, for example, the representatives of the League of Women Voters at state and regional level, the Great Lakes area, and the particular passion and knowledge of Dr. Rosalie Bertel. She had a PhD in mathematics, was a gray nun, and worked as a biostatistician at Roswell Park. And she could move from the specialized knowledge that her biostatistics background gave her to the story of a child with leukemia at Roswell Park that she had gotten to know. She could move easily between science and emotional, spiritual presentation. The organization, the coalition, continued to grow over those years, partly because although cleanup was underway at the site, there was a continuing battle which took place over a whole decade about whether that site should, although they needed to clean up the underground waste as well as the above ground waste, shouldn't it just continue being a repository for New York State's low level radioactive wastes? And that was a fight that took a long time. And once the coalition was through fighting that, and they had been declared not to be the repository for New York State established a siting commission that looked into 10 other sites around the state. And the folks from West Valley joined those folks, and under the principle of, if it's not in my backyard, it shouldn't be in anybody's backyard. And they together engaged in lobbying Albany and following the siting commission around the state as it went to different sites, and fighted the whole concept of putting nuclear wastes into shallow burial and forgetting about them. because they were so long-lived. So the coalition did not go away or weaken over those years between 1980, when it had big influence on what would happen at West Valley until the emergence of this 1996 draft. Now, the 1996 draft. It's not one of my landmarks, and I don't intend to talk about it at length, but I've sort of lost my place in my manuscript here. Back in 1986, when they were debanding this draft, the coalition was particularly focused on the whole issue of erosion. In fact, you might say for their whole history, they were focused on the issue of erosion. And there had been many geological studies in the area that demonstrated, well, you heard all of this from people far more qualified than I, that this site was glacial till that was eventually going to wind up in the Great Lakes. And the eventually was something shorter than the hazardous life of plutonium and other radioisotopes that were buried there. And the activists all along had been incensed at the failure to take erosion seriously. This volume, the draft, emphasis on draft, environmental impact statement that was released in 1996, did indeed finally take erosion seriously. Just look at this next slide. This next slide shows how the 1996 environmental impact statement draft modeled erosion of the site. The purple indicates the area that would have been eroded into the streams, Quarry Creek, Franks Creek, Erdman Brook, and Buttermilk Creek itself. This is the area that would have been eroded into the creeks within 500 years. The purple intruded considerably on the state disposal area, the national disposal area, some lagoons, and it was ominously creeping close to the reprocessing plant and all those nasties that were underneath it, the tanks, which were still in the ground, even after they would have the liquid taken out of them through vitrification, there would be sludge that was highly radioactive in those tanks. And erosion was taken indeed with the greatest seriousness in the 1996 draft environmental statement. I keep emphasizing draft because there was no final. There never was a final of that one. The reason there was never a final is that to face this kind of erosion would be a very expensive and long cleanup process to prevent erosion into the creeks. So I'm not going to talk about the 10 years after that EIS. I still don't understand them, but it was a time of many, many reports and much hand-wringing. The one that I intend to look into eventually, but I was aware of West Valley during that time period. One of my friends who's in fact on this call was following West Valley and trying to get me interested over those years. And I assumed that I could not understand the physics and I didn't want to drive down to Ashford Hollow and never would get involved there. But time goes by and priorities change. There's Gladys clapping. She's the friend who followed it during those difficult years. What came out eventually at the end of that decade was the draft and then the final of what they called the final environmental impact statement for decommissioning or long-term stewardship at West Valley Demonstration Project and West Valley Nuclear Service Center. They called it final, but I always put quotes around it because it really, there was not much in it that was final. About the only thing that the state and federal government could agree on was that most of those buildings needed to come down. And they couldn't come to any agreement about things that were buried underground or about ground. Well, let me read from the statement itself. In order to publish a final environmental impact statement, NYSERDA had to publish at the beginning of it as a preface a clear statement of their differences of opinion with the DOE, the Department of Energy. The state agencies are jointly responsible for this site, which is owned by New York State, but under lease to DOE for the cleanup of the actual reprocessing site. The costs are mostly borne 90% by DOE and 10% by NYSERDA, although they had to go to court to settle exactly where that 90-10 applied and what were strictly state areas where it's the reverse, 90% from New York and 10% from the DOE. So they had some differences of opinion, quote, on soil erosion, groundwater flow, and contamination transport, engineered barriers, and the need for uncertainty analysis. In other words, huge differences between them. And the bulk of the curies of radioactivity remaining on the site, other than what had been solidified and was standing in those glassified canisters of glassified materials, a very large amount of the radioactivity was scattered throughout the site. And those were huge, huge, huge issues. So what's going to happen with those huge, huge areas of disagreement? Well, they've been working on those now for a while. When the draft final EIS came out, it had a comment period, and there was a lot of public interest. That public interest included rallies, nothing as dramatic as the car rally that they'd had back in the 1980s, or the release of balloons marked with symbols of the airborne radioactivity that would be released from the site, but rallies nonetheless, with barrels and congressional speakers. I recognize Brian Higgins there. And it's highly significant that the rallies that were held were at the waterfront, because by then we were seeing our waterfront as a real asset to Buffalo and an asset to tourism, as well as, of course, our source of drinking water. So there was, the coalition and others had really mobilized public comments this time. And they achieved something with it. And I'd like to bring in at this point Barbara Warren, if she'll unmute herself and show us her face, to tell us a bit about this, what they did to get things going. Barbara's the one who's going to present next month, and she joined this group right about then. and worked on the statements that the coalition developed with regard to the draft EIS in 2009. Barbara, there you are.
Hi.
Hi.
So a lot was going on at this time. Essentially, we were working on an independent report with a few of the key people looking at the erosion question. For one, it was the synapse study it was released in the end of 2007, right before the draft was going to be released from DOE. So that was a big issue, and of course we were, working on some of these rallies to get people informed about our continuing concerns about what the plans were for West Valley. But the Synapse report showed that it would be actually cheaper to do a full cleanup now rather than to wait and risk contamination of the waterways that would carry it out to Lake Erie and potentially the drinking water and affecting millions of people. So that was very important at that time. So that and the DOE documents from the Department of Energy and NYSERDA were being circulated really at the same time that year. I don't know if there's other thoughts that you wanted me to present, Pat.
No, that's fine. I would say that the big thing that your involvement at that point achieved was actually quite significant. And that is you all looked around at each other and realized, there's the people, the key leadership had been involved for a long time already. And they looked around at each other and thought, the big thing that this draft did was to kick the can down the line for 30 more years before they would make a decision. And the draft, that's what the draft said. But you pushed to have that reduced to 10 years since you figured none of you would be around at the 30-year mark. And it was actually, I would have thought, a good thing for the people in charge of the cleanup as well, because they, by the end of the 30 years, with so little work to do, so little allowed, so little made in the way of decisions, they probably would have lost some of their workforce. Whereas by shortening it to 10 years, they were able to keep people employed pretty continuously. So it was a very partial victory because there wasn't much to fight about in the draft other than the time period, because they hadn't decided very much yet. But this means that there's still some big decisions ahead of us. At the time, the public was not one of the alternatives, other than the alternative of kicking the can down the road, was to go for a full cleanup. And that's what the public supported. Almost unanimously, I would assume. And everything I've looked at has been very much in favor of just going ahead and the theme at the time was dig it up, dig it all up, get it out of here, or get it more exactly, get it above ground and retrievable and safely stored on the site, insofar as there was no place for it to go yet. If there was a place for it to go, the lower level stuff, fine. But of course, Yucca Mountain, which was to be the ultimate destination of a lot of this stuff, was not a go. And WIP, the other underground site for certain wastes, was not a sure thing for West Valley wastes for reasons that I won't go into here. So in terms, what had changed in public engagement over the years? The big thing was that it was much bigger. That is, there were many more organizations involved with the coalition. When Barbara and her organization sent in comments, their letterhead was huge because other environmental organizations had signed on to the coalition's goals. One thing that I really noticed in going through the third volume of the final impact statement at that point is that, well, first of all, it's huge. That is, it's a whole third volume to the environmental impact statement, just to include the comments that people made and then the response of DOE to those comments. So there were a lot of commentators. Some of them were individuals, some of them were organizations, some of them were coalitions of organizations. Some of them were just brief comments, some of them were long technical analyses, and some of them were resolutions of governing bodies, of local governments. The first, I've put one up here, it was from the Seneca Nation of Indians in Irving and Salamanca. Date, when was it dated? March 14th, 2009. And once they passed this resolution with all its whereases and now therefores, which was basically a resolution for full cleanup, it was passed by villages, towns, counties, cities, including Buffalo, all around Western New York. So there was this massive support for full cleanup. In addition, one thing that I noticed was that the only really visible, although I'm sure there were other individuals as well, the only really visible religious presence at the early meetings back in 1980 was Sister Rosalie Bertel, who had died by the time of this one. She had a reputation as anti-nuclear and anti-war even before West Valley, getting involved at West Valley, and has written books about nuclear dangers, including one that I bought when it was new back in 1985. She was the only really visible religious presence. By 2010, there were whole denominations, as well as organizations of religious women, and in the Catholic Church and Presbyterian denomination at various levels, and interfaith groups, just a lot more religious involvement in the issue of nuclear waste by 2009, 2010. So that local government and religious involvement was new. One of the pieces of irony of 2009 was right near the end of the open comment period for public comments on the draft environmental impact statement. There was heavy rain in August of 2009, and a landslide took down a bank on Buttermilk Creek and brought the whole bank 15 feet closer to the burial grounds, the nuclear dump. And it was just as though it was placing a verification state, a natural verification of the concern about erosion and mass wasting that had been expressed now for 30 years by public activists at West Valley. So that's another good icon of the environmental movement there. Now, what's gone on in the 10 years that the decision-making was postponed? A whole lot, actually. They have been able to maintain a full workforce and continue demolition of above ground, for the most part, of buildings above ground, and make preparations for later work. Due to the formal quarterly public meetings that were established by the coalition's stipulations, we get reports at those quarterly public meetings, as well as monthly reports at the Citizen Task Force, which was established right after the 1996 draft EIS. So we get regular reports on what's going on. This is just a page from one of the screenshot of one of the presentations by the contractor working at the site about the demolition of an office build, an uncontaminated office building attached to the main plant. And it's always very exciting to see these demolitions. They're not the kind of demolition where you blow up a building. That would really be a disaster. With all those radio isotopes, they're more careful demolitions. Things have not gone quite as fast as one would like over those 10 years. For one thing, 10 years from 2010 was 2020, and I thought some things would be happening in 2020. The main plant office building, that's not going to be demolished until probably 2022, and it's going to take 3 years. I mean, the main plant process building, not the office building. The one that they're going to start demolishing shortly has gone over schedule, partly because of underfunding at the beginning at the federal level, and partly more recently because of COVID. But the studies and the negotiations resulting from those studies are clearly taking longer than anticipated as well. That draft of the supplementary environmental impact statement was supposed to come out in 2020, but now we're looking at probably January of 2023 for that to come out, if then. So things lag, but while they lag, work is still going on. Meanwhile, you still have some time to learn a bit of nuclear physics in your retirement or youth. And to decide what really matters to you about this site. You may recognize the title of this slide, I'm a Nuclear Baby, from an op-ed that I wrote in the Buffalo News more than 2 years ago now, when I was really a baby in my understanding of the site. I was born in the same year that the Manhattan Project created plutonium. It's a man-made element that was created by the Manhattan Project by bombarding uranium with a neutron, and it became the basis for the A-bomb. It was our generation, in other words, that created the danger of nuclear war. I wanted to use that baby picture of me on my op-ed, but the Buffalo News insisted that I have an adult picture. So I saved it for this occasion. Our generation too continues to use nuclear power and generate nuclear waste. So my involvement is really based on a sense that our generation is responsible to do our best to find solutions, although we know we're leaving this mess for future generations. And you can't become an expert in all this stuff. You can't even become a beginner, I'm finding, in all of this stuff that you need to know. But there are a lot of us involved, and we all have different things to contribute. One of the things that I am focusing on was brought to my attention early on, and that is that the risk of exposure to low-level nuclear, relatively low-level nuclear radiation is greatest for females more than males, and for those who are exposed at a young age rather than older. So that baby picture for me is another icon of involvement. They often talk about reference man and how much exposure he can take, or at West Valley of the resident farmer, always male, as the key figure in figuring exposure at the site. But I prefer to think about referenced little girl. So whatever priorities at West Valley you turn out to be your priorities, I think there's encouraging reason to be engaged. I don't know where that engagement will take you. If you decide to be engaged, you can join the West Valley Action Network. There's a link on this slide here, but that link will also be in the chat, I believe, and in the mailings afterwards. And you might join in all of their priorities or some of their priorities by writing to your Congress people or your state legislature. Those priorities of the building at this point include some priorities about the demolition of the building, and that is to enclose the building to prevent air pollution and to monitor air, water. They do that, but they don't give us the results promptly often, and they don't give us all the results. They do it primarily on site rather than off site. So the Action Network is asking for continuous real-time off-site air and water monitoring that's publicly accessible, that starts before the demolition so we can see what the baseline is and continues during and after. And one big thing, I mean, we try to watchdog, and I'm sure that employees try to watchdog what's going on site, but the state agencies can be encouraged to do closer oversight of the work, particularly the Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Conservation. And then information. There's always a stinginess with information that we, those of us in the Action Network, keep trying to get past, and that is we'd like to know a lot more a lot sooner about what they're doing with the supplementary environmental statement. Some ways that's often expressed are in the request for an electronic library of the stuff that's going into the supplementary environmental impact statement. And as I've said often enough in this talk, it may be called supplementary, but it's really most of the big stuff there's still left to be decided. So you're not coming to this issue too late if you're just coming to it tonight. I think that finishes it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat. There are several links that we have typed into the chat. And as we mentioned, we will also provide them to you in a follow-up email. But we have about 10 more minutes if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, or you're welcome to type any questions into the chat for Pat or for Barbara, who was involved directly in some of the action.
Has anyone considered stabilizing the waste above ground on piles driven down to the rock so that it doesn't go into the lake eventually?
I haven't heard any analysis like that. Have you, Barbara? There is bedrock.
One of the issues that there was supposed to be from 2010, they proposed to do a long list of studies. Unfortunately, most of those studies were not done. And one of the ones that I considered most important was the stability analysis. In other words, how stable are those very erosion-prone hillsides off of the waterways? They did not do that analysis, so we don't have that right now. It's supposed to be done as part of the environmental impact statement now. It does mean that and possibly other studies may be just, wrapped into the environmental impact statement, which will mean it's going to be very hard to review all the material in a usually very short comment period, before they, finalize the comment period and it's over. So that is a key concern. It's the stability analysis for where those waste sites are. One important thing I want to say about those two dump sites is that all of this happened before most of our major environmental laws. So they chose this land, they put this site here, and all of it was done before any of our major environmental laws occurred, which is in the 1970s. So we don't meet any of the current standards. That's the bottom line.
Certainly earthquake danger would not be resolved by that solution. And that has been one of the concerns over the years, that region really doesn't meet the kinds of earthquake standards you would want for such a site.
That's right. The company had to meet the newer earthquake standards, and they weren't able to do that. And so that's one of the reasons they decided to leave.
Sounds like we want it out of there then.
I didn't quite hear that.
Sounds like we need to move the waste out of that area then.
That's right. It really does not belong there, and it can't meet the standards now, those two waste sites.
We're always in a quandary whether to be willing to have it moved to an interim site, though. So one of our bits of activism has to be to have a permanent site for the waste from here, because if you simply move it to an interim site, it'll be in a hot, flat, and dry place that would be a lot safer and wouldn't threaten the Great Lakes. But then you move it, after moving it through, halfway across the country or all the way across the country, do you move it back somewhere else because suddenly those states decide, well, these things ought to be kept in the state where they were generated? Not a good move, because the moving itself is dangerous.
Yeah, we have to be much more responsible about how we handle this material. And that's still a fight. That's still a major effort on the part of a lot of people around this country right now.
Of the remaining waste, were they generated mostly in New York State or were they imported?
Very few of them were generated in New York State, as a matter of fact. There were only a few nuclear power plants operating at the time. The main one where we got our wastes from was Yankee. Where is that, in New Hampshire or Massachusetts? I've forgotten. Some from Indian Point, but actually the majority of the waste that was processed there in those 6 years came from Hanford, and it was military waste. They had a a nuclear reactor that had as its purpose not producing electricity, but producing plutonium for the triggers on atomic bombs. And because the government was fostering this as a pilot effort, even though the nuclear power industry was not well established, they had promised to provide that kind of waste for getting things started at West Valley. Fortunately or unfortunately, the waste from Hanford, we've been told by one of the workers there in the workers at West Valley in the early years, Dave Piles, the wastes from that reactor were not as hot, not as radioactive as the later waste that they got from power plants. So they weren't really a good test, and the building wasn't really designed to take the hotter wastes that come from nuclear power plants. It was a mess from the beginning. Fortunately, many of the long-term well-trained workers that they have now are doing a much better job than was done in those 6 years of no regulation and or little regulation and little responsibility.
Great, thank you. And to lift up a couple of things that are happening in the chat, someone had asked what the position of the West Valley Coalition was, I believe on where the final location of the material should be. And Ray had answered, it's the same as CTF, that wastes can't stay at the site. And a couple other folks have mentioned a couple other things, just that another good regional example of the instability of material is a slumping and mass wasting that happened south of Springville as Route 219 was being constructed, and what an important lesson that was. And then someone had mentioned that as you were talking about the public hearings, I guess 2 similar public hearings happened in 2013 and 2014 in Ontario, Canada, focused on proposed low and intermediate level deep geological repository promoted by Ontario Power Generation, in which the joint review panel said that there were no significant environmental impacts likely. So it seems like there's a parallel story being told with our friends in Canada as well.
And that's been ongoing. There's been different proposals in Canada involving the Great Lakes. And it's really of serious concern because the Great Lakes are a unique environment where really you don't have a situation like at Fukushima where things blew over to the ocean and mixed with the ocean. Bad as it was with the radioactivity, the Great Lakes are sort of isolated. And what happens in the Great Lakes is the water is evaporated into the clouds, and then it rains again down into the Great Lakes again. So it's a continuous cycle. And so if we do contaminate the Great Lakes in any major way, it's going to stay there for a very long time. It's not being diluted by a body of water the size of an ocean. So we have a lot of concerns about all the proposals in the Great Lakes area. And so we get notices from the folks working in Canada and others who are working in Michigan or Wisconsin, et cetera.
Great. Well, I see we are at time, but I'll see if there is room for one more pressing question. As we mentioned, there is one more conversation we'll have on October 26th, and I'll put that link in the chat. So just opening it up to see if there's one more question that anyone really wants to ask right now.
Can the radioactivity be removed from the water in Lake Erie if we use thousands of gallons for drinking water every day?
That's right. Millions of people would be affected if we have contamination. So that's really a major concern of ours.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I've learned a lot this evening. I know we talked a little bit more about some of the history, some of the science previously, and I'm always energized to hear more about the activism. So thank you, Pat. Thank you, Barb, for sharing your wisdom and time with us this evening. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to type into the chat a link if you're interested in signing up for the October 26th workshop. And we will be following up with some of the links that we have in the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much again, and have a great evening.
Good
Thank
night.
you.